One day you wake up and something feels off. Not because of a crisis, not because anything obvious has fallen apart, but because the life you're living no longer feels like your own. You go through the motions, say the right things, smile when you're supposed to, and yet deep down there's this quiet ache. A feeling that somewhere along the way, you traded something sacred for something safe. And the strange part? No one else notices. Everyone thinks you're doing fine. But inside there's this growing whisper that asks, is this all there is? That whisper, that's not doubt. That's your truth trying to reach you. It's the beginning of what the Buddha called awakening. Not a dramatic event, but a gentle return to what's real. And in today's video, we're going to walk that path together. Through Buddhist teachings, stories, and some truths you may have forgotten, we'll uncover what it really means to stop performing life and to finally start living it. So don't skip a moment. Every part builds on the last, and by the end, something inside you might feel a little clearer, a little lighter, a little more you. And hey, if this message resonates, if you value the kind of quiet truth we share here, there's a simple free favor I'll ask. Just tap the subscribe button. It's how we keep growing this space of stillness, truth, and Buddhist wisdom together. There's something subtle that happens to many of us, but we rarely have words for it. It starts with small compromises. You say yes when you want to say no. You take the job that makes sense on paper, even if it doesn't light anything inside you. You smile to keep the peace, nod along to fit in, and little by little, you begin to slip into roles rather than reality. It doesn't feel like a big deal at first. It feels like being practical, responsible, adult. But over time, something sacred inside starts to go quiet. And the strangest part? No one sees it happening. On the outside, you look like you're doing great, reliable, successful, even admired. But inside, you're slowly disappearing from your own life. It's not that you meant to become someone else, it just sort of happened. You followed the script. Go to school, get the job, build the relationship, keep everyone happy. And somewhere in that long stretch of doing what you're supposed to, you forgot to ask if any of it truly belonged to you. Buddha taught that suffering or dukkha is not always born from obvious pain. Sometimes it's born from this quiet disconnection, from living out a life shaped by expectations rather than inner truth. And the problem is we often don't even recognize it until something shakes us, a loss, a big change, or simply a morning where you look in the mirror and realize you don't quite know the person staring back. We're praised for being dependable, for not making waves, for keeping things together. But what does it cost us to always be the strong one, the steady one, the selfless one? Sometimes the cost is our own identity. We start to believe our value lies only in what we can do for others. We become the caretaker, the provider, the peacemaker. And somewhere behind all of those roles is a self that hasn't spoken in years. Buddha didn't teach that we should abandon our responsibilities, but he did remind us that truth and presence must come first. When we abandon ourselves in service of an image, we step onto the wheel of samsara, the endless cycle of striving, performing, craving approval, and never feeling quite whole. I remember speaking with someone once who said, "I don't even know what I like anymore." It wasn't said with drama, it was quiet, almost casual. But that sentence struck me hard because it's not rare. In fact, it's painfully common. So many people reach midlife or later, having given decades to others, children, careers, partnerships, and when the dust settles, they realize they never really built a relationship with themselves. Buddhism encourages us to turn inward not to escape the world, but to understand our place in it. And part of that journey means asking, who am I when I'm not being who others need me to be? It's a question that can bring up fear. We've been trained to perform for love, to earn it by being good, helpful, useful. But love isn't supposed to cost your soul, and your worth was never meant to be tied to how well you fulfill a role. Buddha's path was about seeing clearly, about breaking through illusion and remembering that you were never meant to be a shadow in your own life. You were meant to be fully present, fully real, and it's never too late to return to that truth. It's strange how a single moment can shift everything. You might be sitting quietly one day, doing nothing out of the ordinary, and suddenly it hits you. This version of your life, the one you've built so carefully, doesn't feel real anymore. It's not that everything is broken or that you're unhappy all the time. It's more subtle than that. It's the slow realization that you've been living according to a script, one that you didn't write. The roles you've played, the choices you've made, the expectations you've met, they've shaped a version of you that looks complete on the outside but feels incomplete within. That realization isn't easy. In fact, it often feels like something is falling apart, but what's really happening is something deeper. The illusion is beginning to crack. In Buddhist philosophy, this is called awakening from illusion, Maya. Maya is not about being deceived by the world in some dramatic way. It's about the subtle layers of identity and habit we adopt to survive, to be accepted, to feel like we belong. Over time, these layers become so familiar that we mistake them for truth. We think we are the job title, the family role, the personality we present. But then something shakes us awake. It could be a crisis, it could be lost, or it could be nothing at all, just a deep feeling that says, "This isn't me." And when that moment comes, it often brings grief. Not because you did something wrong, but because you suddenly see how long you've been asleep. You see the years that passed by while you were busy trying to meet someone else's definition of a good life. You remember the dreams you once had, the person you wanted to become, and you realize how far you drifted. It's not self-pity, it's sacred recognition. The Buddha never promised that awakening would feel like joy at first. In fact, he taught that it often comes through dukkha, or suffering. But not all suffering is bad. Some suffering is necessary. It clears the path. It breaks what needs breaking. This kind of awakening isn't a one-time event. It's not a dramatic scene. It's a series of small, honest moments where you start to question the story you've been living. You pause, you breathe. And in that breath, something shifts. You begin to wonder, if I let go of everything that isn't really me, what would be left? That question, though simple, changes everything. Because at that moment you are no longer running from yourself, you're returning, and that is where your second life begins. There's a kind of clarity that only comes after everything else has fallen quiet, after the noise of striving dies down, after the expectations loosen their grip, after you've stopped trying so hard to become someone and started remembering who you already are. In that quiet, you realize something that feels so simple it almost surprises you. All you ever have is this moment, not the one you're planning for, not the one you regret, but this breath, this inhale, this exhale, and in that realization, something begins to shift. We've been trained to live in timelines, to measure life in achievements, milestones, and ticking clocks. But the Buddha taught that presence, not planning, is where life truly lives. He called it sati, mindfulness, and mindfulness isn't some lofty ideal. It's not reserved for monks in robes or quiet temples on mountaintops. It's here, in your body, in your breath. It's in the way you pause before speaking. On the way, you notice the warmth of sunlight on your face. In the way you let yourself feel what you're actually feeling instead of performing what's expected. Most of us aren't absent from our lives because we don't care. We're absent because we're distracted, because we're busy chasing the next thing or dwelling on the last. We tell ourselves we'll be present when things settle down, when we've accomplished enough to finally deserve rest. But the Buddha reminds us, the present moment doesn't wait for you to be ready. It just is, right now, always. And the only question is whether we'll meet it. Sometimes presence feels ordinary, but that's the magic of it. It takes the ordinary and reveals the sacred. The taste of warm tea, the silence before sleep, the feeling of your own heartbeat. These aren't small things, they're everything, because they are real. And anything that brings you back to what's real is part of the path. When you start living this way, anchored in the now, you notice that your mind slows down. You stop rushing, you stop rehearsing, you start being. And it doesn't mean you abandon responsibility or ignore the future. It means you stop losing your life to the illusion that something else, somewhere else, is more important than what is happening right now. In Buddhism, awakening isn't about escaping reality. It's about returning to it, with clarity, with honesty, with compassion. The Buddha said that the past is gone, the future is not yet here, and the only time we truly possess is this moment. When you grasp that not as a concept but as a felt experience, when you feel it in your bones, that's when your second life begins to root itself. Not in fantasy, but in presence. It's easy to say we want freedom. Who doesn't? We dream about it, we talk about it, we chase it. But when it actually shows up, when the door opens and life says, "You're free to choose now," something surprising happens. We hesitate, because freedom isn't always light and effortless. Sometimes freedom is heavy, not because it weighs us down, but because it asks something deeper of us. It asks for courage, and not the dramatic kind, but the quiet, steady kind. The kind that dares to disappoint others in order to stay honest with yourself. Buddha taught that liberation doesn't come without renunciation, not necessarily of your home or your job or your relationships, but of the illusion that you must always be what others expect, that you must perform, conform, and never stray from the lines drawn for you. Real freedom, the kind that actually brings peace, requires us to let go of those illusions, one by one. And that letting go, it's not always beautiful. Sometimes it feels like loss. Sometimes it feels like you're walking away from everything that made you feel safe, only to enter unfamiliar ground. Think about how many of your decisions have been shaped by fear. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of being alone, fear of being seen as selfish. But Buddha never taught us to live in fear. He taught us to live in truth. And truth, when lived fully, doesn't always fit neatly into society's expectations. Sometimes it requires solitude. Sometimes it requires saying no. Sometimes it means choosing stillness over noise, even when the world insists on shouting. Freedom also means taking full responsibility for your life. No more blaming the script, the roles, the obligations. You are the one holding the pen now, and that can feel overwhelming. But it's also the beginning of something beautiful, because when you stop living to be approved of, you begin living in alignment with your own values. And alignment, the Buddha said, is the root of peace. It doesn't mean everything outside of you gets easier, but it means everything inside of you becomes clearer. There will be people who don't understand, who questions your change, who wonders why you're no longer playing the role you used to. That's okay. Not everyone will be ready to meet the version of you that is no longer pretending. But you must continue anyway, because your freedom is not about their comfort. It's about your integrity. There's a heaviness that settles in when we realize not what we've done, but what we've left undone. Regret doesn't always come crashing in with drama or despair. More often it slips into our quiet moments, late at night, during long drives, in the spaces where distractions fall away. And in those moments, we feel the ache of something lost, not a person, not an opportunity, but a version of ourselves we never allowed to live. That ache can be soft, subtle, but it's persistent, it lingers. In Buddhist teachings, this is a form of dukkha, not just the suffering of pain, but the suffering that comes from clinging to what never was. It's the sorrow of unlived dreams, unspoken words. Paths were never taken because we were waiting for the right time. The Buddha warned us not to get lost in the illusion of permanence. We think there's more time. We think we'll get to it later. But later is never promised. Each breath we take is a gift. And every gift we postpone out of fear becomes a weight we carry. You might think, but I had responsibilities, I had obligations, and that's true. We all make choices based on what we know at the time. This isn't about blame, it's about recognition, because once you see clearly, you can no longer pretend. The Buddha taught that truth doesn't demand guilt, it demands awareness, and with awareness comes liberation, not from the past itself, but from the need to keep avoiding it. I once heard a woman say, "I spent decades keeping the peace. Now I just want to be at peace." That shift is everything. It's the realization that it's not too late. Regret can be a teacher, not a punishment. It points us back to what matters. It reminds us that we are still breathing, still capable of joy, of change, of showing up for ourselves in a way we never have before. But to do that, we have to be willing to listen, to feel the ache without running from it, to ask gently, what have I been postponing? Maybe it's painting again, or calling someone, or finally resting. Maybe it's speaking your truth after years of silence. Whatever it is, it's not too small to matter. The Buddha taught that even a single moment of presence can be transformative. And when that moment is chosen with courage, regret begins to loosen its grip. Because you're no longer just wishing, you're doing. From the very beginning, we are shown what is acceptable. Before we can even speak, we're guided by the rules of good behavior. Be quiet, be polite, say thank you, don't make a fuss. These teachings come with love, but they also come with limits. As we grow, these limits take shape. They become boundaries around our curiosity, our questions, our sense of what's possible. Slowly, we stop looking with our own eyes and start borrowing the vision of everyone else around us. It's not that guidance is wrong. We need structure, especially when we're young. But the problem begins when that structure becomes a script we never question. Buddha spoke about this through the idea of right view, the ability to see clearly. And seeing clearly requires unlearning a lot of what we've been taught, because much of what society gives us isn't designed to free us. It's designed to shape us into something predictable, something acceptable, something easy to manage. That's not awakening, that's programming. We are praised for fitting in, for checking the boxes, for following the timeline. And often we follow it so well that by the time we reach the life we were told to want, we don't even recognize ourselves. We're obedient, but we're not awake. We're efficient, but not free. We're successful, but not alive. And at some point, that disconnect starts to ache. Not loudly, just enough to make you pause and ask, is this really mine? The Buddha taught that suffering isn't just about pain, it's about clinging to illusions. And one of the most persistent illusions is the idea that there is only one correct way to live, that you must earn your worth through performance, that you must shrink your truth to make others comfortable, that your value lies in how little trouble you cause. But true clarity doesn't come from silence. It comes from awareness. It comes from the courage to ask difficult questions, to look at the life you've built and say, where in this do I truly exist? This is not about blame, it's about awakening. No one meant harm by teaching you to obey. But if obedience costs you your inner clarity, then what you need isn't more discipline, it's more vision. You need space to remember how to see with your own eyes again, to return to the part of you that always knew what felt right, even before the world told you what was right. We often convince ourselves that we're not ready. that we need more time, more knowledge, more courage, before we take the step we know deep down we're meant to take. We say, not yet. We wait for a better moment, a quieter season, a clearer sign. But the truth is we're not really waiting for time. We're avoiding the truth, because time doesn't heal what truth avoids. The Buddha never taught us to wait for the perfect moment. He taught us to wake up to the moment we're already in. That awakening doesn't begin in some distant future. It begins the second we stop running from what we already know. We say we're busy, we say we're planning, but often we're just stalling. We scroll through life hoping something will push us to change, all the while knowing that change doesn't come from pressure, it comes from clarity. And clarity isn't found in chaos, it's found in stillness, in presence, in the space where you finally allow yourself to listen to what you've been too afraid to admit. The Buddha's teachings on right intention remind us that it's not about rushing or forcing, it's about aligning. Aligning your life with the truth that's been whispering beneath the noise. Sometimes we pretend we don't know what we want, but we do. It's just that what we want will ask something of us. It might ask us to let go of comfort. It might ask us to walk a path others don't understand. It might ask us to break a pattern that once kept us safe. And that's why we tell ourselves we need more time. But the deeper truth is, you don't need more calendars. You don't need 5-year plans. You need one honest moment with yourself, and when that moment is now as you are. With your fears, your doubts, your imperfections, you don't need to be fully healed. You don't need to have it all figured out. The Buddha didn't wait to reach enlightenment before he began walking. He began with a question, a longing, and the willingness to take a single step toward it. That's all awakening asks of us. Not perfection, just presence. There's a line in the Dhammapada that says, "There is no path to happiness. Happiness is the path." In the same way, there is no perfect future where you suddenly feel ready. Readiness isn't a place you arrive at, it's a choice you make. To stop lying to yourself, to stop delaying what matters, to stop postponing the life that's calling you back home. It doesn't have to be loud, it doesn't have to be dramatic, it just has to be true. Not everything that feels new is actually new. Sometimes it's just a part of you finally waking up after a long sleep. When people talk about transformation, they often imagine starting from scratch, a fresh beginning, a new identity, a completely different path. But in Buddhism, the path to awakening isn't about becoming someone else. It's about remembering who you were before the world convinced you to forget. This is where the idea of Buddha nature becomes so important. According to Buddhist teachings, every one of us has this innate, awakened presence within us. It's not something you have to earn. It's not a prize you get for being perfect. It's already there, beneath the roles, the fears, the years of performance. Your second life isn't a restart button. It's not a dramatic reinvention. It's a return. A quiet, gentle, peeling back of the layers until you find something soft and real at your center, your true self. Think of it like this. When you were a child, there were things you loved simply because they made your soul feel alive. Maybe it was painting, or writing stories, or sitting by the window and watching the rain. As life went on, many of those things were set aside for responsibilities, for survival, for approval. But they never disappeared. They just waited. And now, in the stillness of your awakening, those parts begin to whisper again. They don't demand attention. They invite it. They say, "Come back. I'm still here." And so, your second life begins not with a bang, but with a breath. Not with a revolution, but with a return. Maybe you pick up the paintbrush again, or you begin saying no to what drains you, or you finally start speaking to yourself the way you always needed someone else to. You don't have to change your whole life, you just have to change your relationship to it. When Teresa, a woman I once met in her 70s, started painting again after decades of silence, she told me, "I didn't need a new life. I just needed to stop abandoning the one I already had." That's what a return looks like. It's not flashy, it's sacred. And yes, people may not notice right away. They might still see the same version of you, but inside, everything shifts. You're no longer chasing something outside. You're rooting back into something true, something stable, something that doesn't change with opinion or trend. And that kind of shift isn't just personal, it's spiritual. It's the very heart of Buddhist practice. It's one of the most difficult parts of awakening, realizing that the more you begin to live honestly, the more others may step away. You finally take a breath that feels true, you start saying what you actually mean, and suddenly some of the people closest to you seem confused, uncomfortable, even disappointed. And it hurts. Not because you've done something wrong, but because for the first time, you're choosing honesty over approval. We are social creatures. From a young age, we learn to smooth our edges, to hide our discomfort, to become whatever is needed in order to be liked, accepted, welcomed. That training runs deep. And when you begin to unlearn it, when you finally listen to your own voice instead of the crowd's, it will shake things loose. Buddha never said that awakening would come without discomfort. He simply taught that truth is more valuable than popularity, and freedom more precious than acceptance. And when you start to live from that place, not everyone will come with you. But here's the deeper truth: their confusion isn't really about you. It's about the mirror you hold up. When you live honestly, you become a reflection of the things they've suppressed, of the freedom they haven't claimed, of the courage they're still afraid to touch. And not everyone is ready to look. That's not your fault. And it's not your burden. Buddhism teaches compassion, not just for others, but for yourself. You don't need to defend your growth. You don't need to justify your peace. You simply need to walk your path. And yes, it may be quieter at first. The invitations might stop. The group chats might go silent. But something else begins to grow. A deeper relationship with yourself. A trust. A wholeness. A calm that doesn't depend on performance. People will call it selfish, people will call it strange. But the Buddha said, peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. And when you start living in alignment with that kind of peace, something profound happens. You stop needing everyone to understand you. You stop begging for permission. You simply live, fully, truly, quietly. There's something subtle but dangerous about the promise of later. It doesn't shout, it doesn't force, it simply whispers. Tomorrow. Tomorrow you'll speak your truth. Tomorrow you'll take the first step. Tomorrow you'll slow down and finally breathe. And before you know it, days turn to months, and months turn to years. The life you imagine doesn't disappear all at once. It just fades, quietly, while you wait for the perfect moment to begin. Buddha's teachings remind us that this moment, this breath, this heartbeat, is the only one we are guaranteed. He never promised a future. He simply pointed to now and said, start here. We keep thinking we need more confidence, more signs, more certainty, but what we really need is more truth, more willingness to say, I'm ready, even when we don't feel ready at all. Because readiness doesn't come before we begin. It arrives because we did. And the truth is, you don't need a dramatic change. You don't need to quit everything or move across the world. Sometimes beginning is as small as saying no to something that no longer fits. Sometimes it's writing the first line of a story you were too scared to tell. Sometimes it's walking through your day with a little more awareness, a little less urgency. In Buddhism, this kind of beginning is known as right effort, the gentle, ongoing practice of turning toward your truth without force, without rush. Beginning, doesn't mean everything will change overnight. It means you change your relationship to the moment. You stop postponing your peace. You stop waiting for the world to approve. You stop telling yourself the story that you'll live fully once everything is figured out. The Buddha saw through that illusion. He taught that clinging to the idea of a perfect future is one of the deepest sources of suffering. We miss what's real because we're addicted to what could be. So what if, just for today, you decided that now is enough? Not perfect, not polished, but enough. What if this breath right now could be the beginning, not of a new identity, but of a new relationship to life? One where you meet yourself without judgment, one where you move slowly, speak honestly, and show up fully. The second life doesn't ask for grand declarations. It asks for presence. It asks for courage. It asks for a quiet yes. And when you say yes, not loudly, not dramatically, but sincerely, you begin. That's the real shift. You step out of the story you've been rehearsing and into the one you were born to live, the one where your truth leads the way, the one where your peace is not some distant goal but a moment-by-moment return to what matters. And now, as this reflection comes to a close, maybe something within you feels a little more seen, a little more remembered. That's not by accident. It's because the life you're longing for isn't far away. It's just on the other side of one quiet, honest decision, not to change everything, but to begin living with truth right where you are. If today's message touched something in you, don't let it end here. Let it begin something. There's another video waiting for you right on this screen, one that will walk this path with you even deeper. Watch it. Thank you for being a part of Buddhist Journey. May your path be gentle and your heart awake.